Circular economy investment strategy for manufacturing sector. It will be presented by Yulia Dobroyubova, who is a partner from ERM. So please welcome Kun Yulia in the next topic.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Very nice to see you all today, online or here in present, and happy to be actually for the first time after the start of the pandemics in this kind of hybrid event. Hopefully we will have more face-to-face going forward. So now we're moving on to the next very important sector for the Thailand 4.0 strategy, as well as for the Eastern Economic Corridor area, which is the manufacturing sector. All right. So first of all, what does manufacturing sector cover? For our study, we were focusing only on the four so-called high-tech industries that are relevant for EEC area, which are next generation automotive sector, digital, robotics, as well as aviation and related services. So similarly to the previous sector, we first of all looked into the traditional linear value chain, as we did also for the bio-based sector and other sectors for our study. And we tried to identify what could be the typical issues related to our sector here and where circularity hotspots could be integrated. It's quite a busy slide, but I would suggest that we focus first of all at the bottom line, which is the key summary of what the typical issues are in our manufacturing sector. So if we look first of all upstream, the way how our manufacturing products are designed and where the raw materials are sourced from and how manufacturing processes are looked like, you can see that there are a lot of environmental resources and energy related issues to how this is all produced, and not just in Thailand, but globally as well. In fact, for the high-tech technologies, we need to use a lot of rare earth and other minerals and materials that are quite critical, but at the same time, their mining takes a lot of energy and resources. So that's something that needs to be taken into account in our circularity program to make sure how we actually can reuse those minerals and materials from already existing products rather than mining them from the scratch. Secondly, manufacturing processes also could be improved. And again, electric vehicles, for example, definitely is a great way how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through their use. However, if you look into manufacturing of the components and in the first place, batteries for electric vehicles, this is also a very energy consuming process, which needs to be improved going forward to reduce the value chain emissions of electric vehicles. Downstream, if we look into, for example, distribution, consumer use, and especially end of life of our products from the manufacturing sector, the most critical element is actually how we can, again, loop in traditional linear processes and start reusing and recycling more materials from those products, and as well as extending the life of those products to make them be used longer. So these are the most critical elements of the manufacturing sector that we identified. And now moving on to the hotspots and the slide that Rati has presented before. So you remember the 7 hotspot areas, and as Rati has mentioned, they are not necessarily directly connected one hotspot area to one sector, but we have identified the key focus areas that may be relevant for across different industries. So with respect to the manufacturing sector, we looked in particularly into 2 key circularity hotspots. The first one is battery management. And as you can see from the slide, it is very specific to electric vehicles or mobility sector. However, addressing battery management circularity hotspot, you can potentially also expand it to some other manufacturing industries, even beyond the e-mobility. Secondly, end of life and material recovery. This is another hotspot area. And as you can see here, that would be relevant for all high-tech digital technologies, such as also aviation, logistics, intelligent electronics, as well as automation and robotics. So those two we'll look into more detail during this session. Lastly, looking into the circularity framework and how the processes could be improved. Once again, the three areas that we will be discussing today during this session, and also in line with what we have just discussed for the bio-based sector. First of all, circular value chain. What does it mean in terms of our manufacturing sector and circularity hotspots identified? Well, first of all, is design. How our products are designed from the beginning so that you don't use that much resources and materials anymore for their production, and also how you can integrate renewable energy technologies into the production processes. The second element is recovery and reuse. This is pretty much about how we can reverse sustainable supply chain and use more resources from already existing products instead of creating components from the scratch. And also how to establish market for second-hand parts. Lastly, product life extension. This is a very important element for this circularity hotspot, and how we can actually extend the life, how we can support maintenance and for the existing products and services, and also how we can support the local market in Thailand for repair, resale, and remanufacturing for parts and components. All right, with that, let's move on to our first hotspot and explore it in more detail. And we will be talking about battery management. All right. Well, first of all, we should mention that globally and in Thailand as well, electric vehicles market is expanding. Already today, electric vehicles represent about 1% of the total sales and in the market, which is still low if we compare it, for example, with European countries or Japan, China, and other markets. However, the intention is there, and Thailand has ambitious plans to expand the share of electric vehicles to 30% by 2030. This is definitely a great incentive for the industry and for investors to look into this specific sector. However, there are certain challenges, as we have discussed, related to making this sector low carbon and circular. And the three areas that would need attention going forward to promote electric vehicles, and more specifically battery management, are: the first one is the charging accessibility and use of renewable sources of energy for charging. And we looked here into both Thailand case studies and international case studies, and this is definitely one of the important areas for the EV sector globally as well. So definitely how to make the charging stations more accessible, how to strategically plan the network of charging stations, how to manage between supply and demand, and especially costs for charging, and also how to potentially differentiate between charging costs and times during the day. Obviously, an important element here would be also providing access to renewable energy sources so that we can really differentiate and make electric vehicles low carbon. Second area of attention for the battery management is battery technology and cost. So how we can actually make batteries more affordable. Because as of now, one of the main issues with the use of batteries in electric vehicles is their cost. And another important piece here would be how we actually improve the battery life, and also can reuse components of the battery, minerals from it going forward for producing new batteries or other products. And the last important element of the battery management is how we make the batteries themselves low carbon and safe for use. And one of the important points we would need to mention here is that Thailand is already producing some types of batteries. However, if we look into specifically lithium-ion batteries that are key for electric vehicles, or even modern types of batteries, such as, for example, solid-state lithium-ion or zinc air technologies, they still need to be localized in Thailand, which is not the case yet. However, there are some initial programs, but this definitely needs to be scaled up so that we can meet the growing demand for batteries for EVs. One of the hurdles here is that in Thailand, we don't have that much of the rare earth minerals, such as lithium, for example, that would be needed for these types of batteries. But this is something that we can discuss, of course, and maybe make potential partnerships with other countries like Indonesia, where these minerals will be easier to access. And this is one of our recommendations that we will look into going forward. Moving on. As I mentioned, during this study, we looked into international cases, what is going on in other parts of the world. And for electric vehicles market, definitely European Union would be one of the great examples where there is a lot of support from the government, both at the national level, but also at the local levels to promote EVs. And interestingly, if you look into the flower chart at the bottom of this slide, there are 3 key areas of attention for EV promotion that were developed by the World Economic Forum. And you will see that it's pretty much the same as we have presented for the EEC attention. And the most important part is that there is a lot of focus on collaboration and partnerships. For battery management and EV sector, you cannot do it alone, just with transportation sector. For example, it's definitely a big partnership between transportation, power sector, as well as the battery production industry. So that would be the main important point for this sector. In case of the European Union, there is a very interesting initiative that has been established, which is called Battery 2030 Plus. It's an incentive to really localize and modernize the battery industry in the European Union, which is promoted by the European Commission in collaboration with academic research institutions, technology providers, and many, many other stakeholders, as you can see on this slide. It's a large initiative worth hundreds of millions of euro to basically support the localization of battery production in the European Union. However, this is a very interesting initiative that could be potentially replicated in Thailand as well, creating a hub for battery production here to support electric vehicles, or collaboration with European Union that could also support through their initiatives and fundings, similar incentives here in Thailand, and also to support production of certain components for European market. Moving on to the next slide. We can see some of the opportunities that exist for the battery management sector in Thailand. Well, starting from the battery electric vehicles production, as I mentioned previously, there is a big ambition of the Thailand government to promote 30% of the total Thai automotive production being electric vehicles by 2030. And there are already quite a few incentives in place for investors in this sector, including some tax incentives, manufacturing rebates, import duties. However, as we mentioned as well, the share currently of electric vehicles is relatively low as compared to the ambitious target. So definitely there is a room for investments in this space and to creating localized value chains and circular value chains. The second opportunity area is the manufacturing of parts and equipment for electric vehicles. As we know, there are quite a few electric vehicle types already being offered on the market, but only 2 of them in Thailand are actually being completely developed here in Thailand. So there is big room to develop more parts and equipment and components, including batteries, here in the country and in the EEC area in particular, so that more cars could be manufactured here. That could also help address all kinds of import duties and other taxes related to import of components from abroad. Third area is the charging station operators. So we mentioned that to solve the EV promotion issue, we need to focus not only on the EV vehicles and batteries themselves, but also on the supply of charging infrastructure and making it more accessible to electric vehicles users. So here, it's very important to look into potential opportunities to collaborate with large oil and gas companies, as well as with other players and even startup companies to develop this charging station network in the EEC area. And as you can see here on the slide, there are already quite a few incentives in place in Thailand that support development of charging stations, including corporate income tax, lower cost due to investment subsidy from Ministry of Energy and Electric Vehicle Association of Thailand, temporary lower electricity prices, tax holidays, and so on. Another important initiative that has been established in Thailand is the EV Charging Consortium that also helps develop demand for electric vehicle charging. Lastly, production of EV batteries, that's another important area for investments in Thailand. That could be a great and interesting circularity hotspot for this area. And as we mentioned before, currently the majority of batteries that are being produced in Thailand are more for hybrid vehicles. However, it would be important to develop more market for batteries for battery electric vehicles and develop new types of batteries such as solid state lithium-ion technologies, for example. So a lot of focus is on innovation, research and development and capacities, as well as seeing how we can do the sourcing of minerals locally, for example, through recycling of those minerals from existing components and batteries. Moving on, similarly to bio-based sector, we have conducted a gap assessment, looking into what is already being done in Thailand and what could be potential opportunity areas to support battery management in the country. Firstly, starting with policies and regulations, we have seen already an ambitious target to promote electric vehicles. We also see quite a lot of policies and incentives around the uptake of electric vehicles, as well as for development of charging infrastructure. However, there are certain gaps between the policies and what is actually happening on the ground. So definitely the pace of the development of the infrastructure and EV sector as such is not yet to meet the ambitious targets. So that's something that we may want to look into in more detail, and especially policies around extending life of the batteries and also policies around how we can potentially reuse the materials from the batteries and other components of electric vehicles. Second important point is the infrastructure. Again, there is a very strong infrastructure base in place to promote usage of electric vehicles in the country. However, the main concerns at the moment would be around how we can expand this infrastructure to really meet the fast growing demand for electric vehicles across all different sectors. And especially for EEC area, where electric vehicles will be playing a very important role for all industries, be it for the industries themselves or for employees who work at these industries. So definitely we would need to pay a bit more attention into that. On the positive side, if we look into business strategy, there is definitely a lot of focus on how we can promote electric vehicles use in the country, as well as how we can create development of EV components here locally. In fact, Thailand already is a tier 2-3 producer of many components for electric vehicles for global brands, for global companies, but it will be really interesting to see how we can transform Thai market, especially in the EEC zone, to become tier 1 supplier of those components. Partnerships, we have seen already great examples in the EV sector, in particular in Thailand, with the EV Charging Consortium and Electric Vehicle Association of Thailand. So definitely that's where Thailand is already performing quite strongly. And again, as we mentioned, this is the sector that where you cannot go by without those strong partnerships between different players. As for the supply chain, again, we mentioned that There is a lack of localized EV production, and especially the batteries production. So that's an area where we can develop more in Thailand. And technology and innovation would be one of the key elements to that. And lastly, social culture. It's very interesting that EVs in principle is something that needs to be promoted a bit more in Thailand, because still the consumers' demands are more towards traditional cars. However, going forward, we need to create more acceptance and preference towards electric vehicles, including through financial incentives and creating better infrastructure for EVs, including through charging. And here we come to the first Menti poll for this sector. And very similarly to the bio-based sector, the first question would be about what are, in your opinion, the main obstacles for the battery management promotion in Thailand? And you can select up to 3 different options. Let's give a few moments for everyone. All right, we can see answers coming in, and actually quite diverse. All right, let's see. So far, interestingly, the majority says it's a matter of EV promotion policies and battery promotion policies. However, most of other barriers have been mentioned by the respondees as well. Let's give maybe another minute for those who are joining us online to vote as well. All right. Well, thank you very much. You can still continue with your voting going forward, but I think the main output of this Menti session is that generally all those barriers matter. Maybe lack of localized EV production was not considered as such a big issue, whereas all other barriers have been confirmed. All right, let's move on to the next part. Thank you very much. And here is what we consider as the main focus areas for promotion of circularity for the battery management hotspot area. This is what we call the log frame, a logical framework for the circularity promotion. And as always with this kind of frameworks, my suggestion would be to look bottom up. So look first at the bottom of the slide, what we actually would like to achieve as desired outcomes. And then everything on top would be activities that are leading towards this desired outcome. So in the first place, if we talk about design for circularity, one of the key elements of our circularity promotion framework, what we would like to see more in Thailand is the enhanced policies and incentives aimed at increasing EV adoption. And this is very much in line with what you have been voting for during your Menti session. The second element to that would be enhanced uptake and usage of established charging infrastructure with planned growth across non-metros locations. And let's see, for the actual actions to achieve those desired outcomes, what we suggest is the overall redesign of the EV charging infrastructure in EEC area in a way that is compatible to global design specifications. It really meets the users' needs, and also it has flexible charging requirements and can also adapt the costing to different times of the day, for example, and it also can allow for fast charging and enhanced accessibility. And this is where, again, the partnerships with key players on the market could play an important role. The next element, rethink business model. So let's see, the desired outcomes would be to create an affordable new age fast charging infrastructure. So in a way, you also reduce the extend the battery lifetime and also improve the accessibility of the charging for EV. And this would also mean expanded partnerships in EV and battery manufacturing space to include players in tier 1 manufacturing. And also to look into end-of-life battery management and battery recycling. And to do so, the main activities would be to make simpler demand chargers to enable adoption of new age fast charging infrastructure, and to extend value chain services, business partners, to include also battery manufacturers and e-waste and technology players. And in the next hotspot, when we will be talking about material recovery and life extension, we will look into some examples of these partnerships from other countries. The third area is to promote collaborations. And again, the desired outcomes would be around, and here we'll talk about from the production of components up till the recycling of e-waste from the EVs, and extended infrastructure for EV battery management. And to do so, the main activity would be to develop additional and targeting user outreach programs to promote charging infrastructure on the one hand, and on the other hand, to promote e-waste management from the EVs. The last area would be technical enablement for circularity. And here the desired outcomes would be around established innovation hub for EV players, focusing on new age technologies for batteries in the first place, but also for electric vehicles, as well as recycling technologies, as we said. And also established integrated drive systems, one-stop charging stations aligned with the international standards, like ISO 15118. And to do so, the main activity areas would be implement policy interventions for new age disruptive technologies, support research and development, similar to the battery 2030 plus program that we saw in the European Union, maybe in collaboration with the European Union and other international partners, and the rise of integrated drive systems that will require new investments. And I would like to pause here for another Menti session, just to see what do you think about the key strategic priorities that would be needed for the promotion of circularity investments in the battery management segment. So if we can switch to the Menti again, please. Thank you very much. And we can see already some of the answers in the system. So the question was, which of the suggested focus areas for the circularity promotion strategy for the battery management would be, in your opinion, important? And the majority, as you can see here, voted for the extend value chain services and business partnerships in this area, as well as implementation of policy interventions for new age disruptive technologies and R&D support. However, all other areas have been also noted as important ones, maybe with the exception of new investments into integrated drive systems, which was given less priority. Thank you very much, and we move on. All right. And now we're moving to the most important part of the battery management sector discussion. What would be the action plan, looking back at the circular economy promotion strategy? So as for the bio-based sector, we have also divided the key actions into phases 1 to 3, depending on how short-term they are in terms of urgency and also implementation opportunities. If we talk about technological support, What we would like to have in Thailand, an EEC zone, is the established Thailand battery management value chain from the very beginning of production of batteries till the very end of batteries, recycling, refurbishment, and generally e-waste management. We feel that that would be more phase 2, phase 3 action, just because there has to be a lot of preliminary work that needs to go into there, including incentives, creating partnerships. But we hope that towards phase 3, that would be achievable. To get there, as I mentioned, it would be very important to introduce enabling policies and regulations. Amongst those, the most important ones would be related to EV batteries support for production and for refurbishment, and more generally for e-waste management. On the other side, for the charging stations, it would be also important to support their future expansion in the EEC area. All right. Another important area of action would be to manage between supply and demand for the charging stations in particular, but more generally for electric vehicles market expansion. And here it would be very interesting to look into incentives for oil and gas and other startup players, so we can really manage the current initiatives going forward, so they better meet the fast-growing demand for EV charging. Looking into human capacity, Thailand in general has already a very good base and a lot of good academic and research foundation for the EV sector and batteries in particular. But it would be really good to look into design and launch a series of awareness campaigns for broader acceptance of electric vehicles in the market, especially if we want to reach out the ambitious target of 30% by 2030. And another important element to that would be the enabling understanding of how we can, through electric vehicles, also improve the low carbon economy in Thailand, achieve net zero targets, as well as how we can make the electric vehicle sector more circular, including through the management of e-waste and batteries at the end of their life. The next step would be to develop additional and targeting user outreach program to promote charging infrastructure for long distance commute and connect this initiative with overall EV promotion in Thailand. Another important area of action for EECO would be around digital solutions. And for this sector in particular, would be really important to launch Thailand's integrated battery management platform. So there is an access for users to opportunities where they can find batteries, or where they can exchange batteries, which is already existing in the European Union as the first initiatives, as well as more guidance, easily accessible guidance on the charging opportunities, fast charging, and so on and so on. The last but not the least, if we talk about stakeholder involvement and awareness, it would be really important to develop new and strategic charging station placement plans and reposition them for long distance commute and no metro connectivity, especially in the EEC zone, where electric vehicles probably will be promoted even at a faster rate than overall in the country. And in terms of research and development collaboration, it would be also important to promote next generation battery technology and connect the same to improved electric vehicles uptake in the country and in the EEC market. And here we can partner with new technology providers, and as well as with other countries, as we mentioned before, for the supply of important materials and products for the batteries manufacturing here in Thailand. All right, then I suggest we move on to the last Menti session in this hotspot. Thank you very much. And the question was about suggestions on the action plan. Thank you very much. And we were tasked to rank the suggested actions for battery management based on your perceived priority from high to low. So let's see the results. The first place is improve incentives based on demand supply. So really managing demand and supply, and especially from the policy and incentive side. The second popular answer was establishment of battery management value chain in the EEC area, providing technological support for batteries refurbishment and e-waste management. The third most popular answer was review policy related to charging stations. The fourth, awareness campaigns, followed by user outreach programs and integrated battery management platforms, which is, by the way, quite in line with the prioritization of actions as it was in our action plan. So what received less votes actually is more like a longer term solution, though important, whereas those that are on top of this pyramid are really critical ones. Thank you very much. And with this, we just have one closing slide for the battery management hotspot before we move on to the next one. But before then, actually, one case study from the World Economic Forum that developed a study on the global promotion of battery management that they did together with the Global Battery Alliance. And you will see that on this slide that effective battery management, making it circular and low carbon, actually can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30%, helping us achieve the Paris Agreement target. Secondly, it can create a lot of new additional jobs, and at the same time, creating additional co-benefits, like, for example, reduce costs related to battery use and EV costs in general, and especially in the emerging economies like Thailand. However, to be able to achieve those sustainability benefits, quite critical would be those 4 areas mentioned on this slide, which is very much in line with our recommendations for the EEC, which are policy and regulatory incentives and framework, technical and logistical support, digital platform and solutions, as well as new business models and value chains. But the most important and critical element, as you can see here, is also around policies and regulations that need to be fixed in the first place to enable the next steps. And this slide is just looking a little bit more into details of the current European Union promotion scheme for the batteries management, led by the European Commission, but in close collaboration with the research and development organizations, with technology providers and electric vehicles manufacturers. And what is interesting, this partnership on batteries is not only to support the local production, but also to provide finance for international companies, including, for example, in Thailand, that could also apply for the support through the Innovation Fund to develop those supply chains for the batteries. All right, and this is the last slide that I promised. So again, similarly to the bio-based sector, we have identified the main focus areas, main success factors, what is needed for the battery management in the EEC area for us to move forward with the investments in this space. So on the policy side, we have mentioned that that's quite critical, both for the charging stations, but also for the e-waste management and extending battery lifetime and battery refurbishment. For partnerships, that's a very important sector where we need participation of the power, transport, as well as the battery manufacturing sectors altogether. And definitely collaboration between government, R&D, academic, industrial, and other partners, as we saw on example from the European Union. From the process side, it would be important to further provide financial incentives, making charging possible using renewable energy sources and making battery design and the whole life cycle more circular. On the business strategy side, it would be important to build own localized supply chains for batteries and EVs more generally in Thailand, an EEC zone ideally. And that would be an important growth hub for the EV sector, for the country as a whole, and potentially also for the region, knowing that how fast EV market is growing around ASEAN. In terms of infrastructure, the two important areas would be, of course, the charging stations that we mentioned already, but also establishing vehicle dismantling facility, as well as the facilities for e-waste management and refurbishing facilities for used batteries. On the social culture side, nothing critical, it's just like continuation of already ongoing awareness campaigns and programs to genuinely support the acceptance of electric vehicles. On the technology innovation, definitely integrated battery management platform and development of next generation batteries, as we mentioned. And supply chain would be pretty much similar to business strategy, localized production, localized end-of-life processes to make the processes generally circular as compared to traditional linear ones. And in particular for EECO, because most of those recommendations that we have developed are more generally for the different stakeholders in Thailand, but specifically for EECO, where you could play a role. Well, first of all, of course, is to support the battery advancement in the EEC area. And this could be done through localized manufacturing, of course, and supporting R&D for making this localized manufacturing possible. The second area is value chain integration, and also developing more localized e-waste management opportunities, the local facilitation centers, local dismantling centers, and facilitation for the e-waste overall management and platforms around this as well. And the last point is about enhanced connectivity, really playing as the intermediary role to connect different partners together that are relevant for the EV sector and the battery management hotspot in particular, including providing guidelines, awareness campaigns, standardization, in helping in also promoting information around the initiatives that are being taken place. I'll pause here for any questions that may be ready from the floor before we move on to the next hotspot. As I don't see any questions, I suggest I move on to the next hotspot in the sake of time. And if you still have any questions specific to the battery management, we can come back to this at the end of the session. Thank you very much. And we're moving on to another exciting hotspot area, which is called end of life and material recovery. Great. So when we were talking about battery management, in fact, we touched upon this a little bit, specifically to batteries for electric vehicles. On this slide, you can see, in principle, there are three options what you could do with batteries and any other components of the electronic and the high-tech industries. The first, the simple one, but the most high emission one as well, is just disposal. It could go to landfill and probably not managed in the right manner, creating additional environmental issues. The other two options would be much better from the environmental as well as from the circularity standpoints. First is refurbishment or reuse, which means that the spent batteries can be used for the second time extending their lifetime this way. And the third option is the recycling. So you really extract important materials, for example, nickel or cobalt from those batteries to be used in other production processes. And this can be applicable not just for the batteries, but all other components of our high-tech industries that are relevant for EEC, be it robotics, be it digital, data centers, servers, for example, if we talk about them, or if we talk about aviation and logistics. So an important consideration here would be to look into how we can, instead of just disposing those materials at the end of their life and products, to reuse them and bring back into our manufacturing processes. And a very interesting example that I promised to show you during the previous session is from Japan, where actually there has been a policy on mandatory recycling of used batteries already since a decade at least. And the government is working very closely both with manufacturers of batteries and products that batteries use, as well as with the recyclers, as well as, of course, the EV manufacturers, and making it in a way that the costs of the recycling do not pass on to the consumers, making this process commercially attractive for all the players in this cycle. But it wouldn't be possible, of course, without those supporting policies from the government and the partnerships and the frameworks that they have established within the country to make this circular loop happen. As we can see globally, the idea of extending of lifetimes of materials and products, as well as this end-of-life processes like refurbishing or recycling, is globally a very important and difficult topic. And in other countries, not only in Japan, but like the European Union, US, China, and of course ASEAN countries are increasingly looking into this hotspot. And lastly, in doing this, we can address many different sustainability concerns. For example, of course, reducing the unnecessary use of resources, materials, bringing all those elements back in our production system instead of just disposing them and producing something from scratch. All right, so speaking about EEC in particular, what could be the opportunities for investment in the end of life and recycling for the high-tech industries? Well, first of all, if we talk about the 4 manufacturing industries under the sector, you remember that one of them was aviation and logistics, which is very, very important for the EEC area in particular, if we want to promote EEC as the regional APAC hub. So obviously, we need to look into what would be opportunity areas for aviation and logistics in more detail. And we know that currently Singapore plays an important hub for this area, but we definitely would like to see EEC playing a more important role. And opportunities could be, for example, in investing into maintenance of aircraft and providing local services for this. And for this, obviously, it would be very important to create, again, collaborations with different partners that exist on the market, or creating even new structures. Interestingly, this could be a potential area also for international collaboration, because obviously, if we talk about aviation, we are talking about global players here. The second opportunity area is about creating Utapao Airport Industry Zone, focusing on maintenance, repair, and overhaul, or what we call shortly MRO. And again, here in Thailand, there are already a lot of incentives around promotion of MRO, and this is definitely a very interesting opportunity area to invest, and this way also to promote circularity in the country and EEC, using Utapao as the hub for that. And lastly, end-of-life technology development, focusing here on again, EV battery, as we mentioned in the previous hotspot, but also on other different components and materials across our high-tech industries. All right, so similarly for this hotspot, we have done a gap analysis to look into what is already being done in Thailand and EEC. And this is a quite innovative area, and definitely there are certain things that have been done already, like for example, for the infrastructure, we can see that there is a stable and evolving infrastructure to support MRO industry in the EEC area in particular, with the new incentives having been announced and general ambition to create a strong hub here in the region for MRO. But the same infrastructure can be extended to, for example, e-mobility sector, and creating MRO support for electric vehicles, not just for aircrafts. So if we look into policies and processes, currently, there is lack of comprehensive incentives and regulatory framework to support extension of the end of life for electric mobility or for airlines to promote material recovery in the value chain. So similarly to the initiative that was done by Japan, for example, quite some time ago, it would be very, very important for Thai government to support similar partnership schemes and incentives to actually promote recovery instead of disposal of the materials. And there is a very important need to strengthen the business models, making this recovery commercially attractive for the players who are part of this value chain. For the business strategy, there are already activities in place in Thailand to support MRO industries. And there are already tier 2 and 3 suppliers here in Thailand, but it would be very interesting, similarly to the battery management, to shift from just tier 2 and 3 to tier 1 production of components needed for the refurbishment and repair. And for that, again, we need to create partnerships here. We need to create necessary infrastructure skills, as well as potential ecosystem for making those parts available on the market instead of using new ones. We spoke about partnerships, we spoke about supply chain. Technology innovation would be very critical for this Secularity hotspot. Again, because we talk about innovative industries by themselves. We talk about innovative processes where we really need to think how we can create those circular value chains and how we can manage e-waste, which is by itself quite an innovative area. So definitely partnerships with research and development institutions, with foreign partners would be quite important here. And lastly, social culture. That's a very important part for this hotspot area, because we would need to promote the idea within the society that we don't need to dispose components, but instead really bring them back into the cycle, for which a lot of awareness and capacity building and upskilling would need to happen. And I pause here for a moment to go to the Menti poll. And similarly, let's select up to 3 key obstacles for promoting material recovery and reuse in Thailand and EEC zone. And we can already see some results. Thank you very much for projecting those. So the most popular answer was the lack of comprehensive policies and incentives, followed by lack of business models for promotion of end of life and material recovery. And then limited number of MRO players in the market, and especially in the aviation industry. And other barriers have been mentioned as well. But as you can see here, yes, policies and incentives have been put up front as the most critical barrier important for this hotspot. Thank you. And I suggest we go back to the slides. So we spoke about key obstacles and some areas where Thailand is already doing good. Let's move on to the investment strategy promotion framework. And again, similarly to the last session, let's move on let's look at this bottom up to see where we want to be and then what needs to happen to get us there. So in terms of design for circularity, how we can actually design our systems to allow for extended lifetime as well as for the recycling of components. Well, we would like to have more focus on modular and reconfigurable interiors for aircrafts, for example. In this way, we can reuse them for new aircrafts again. We would like to drive towards increasing the lifespan of products, and we would like to reduce dependency on new materials, parts and components, making it possible to again and again and again reuse components from the previous models. What is needed to get us there? Well, it would be very interesting to focus more on additive manufacturing to reduce waste and energy use through this process and, of course, greenhouse gas emissions. It would be very important to define fiscal instruments to increase the relative cost of new parts as compared to reusing old parts and making, again, the infrastructure in place, making those old parts available on the market. We would like to enable increased availability of second-hand parts for MRO in particular, and promote design optimization to increase structural efficiency. So making our products designed in a way so they from the very start are meant to be reused going forward as their components. The second one is Rethink business model. So first we talked about design. The second is how we make business model conducive in Thailand for the end-of-life extension and recycling. So we would like to expand players in MRO sector and create more partnerships. As of now in Thailand, there are actually only 7 active players in MRO, which is not enough, but the new initiatives are appearing on the market, so it will be very, very important to promote those. Refurbishing parts to reset fatigue, reduce waste and eliminate reuse of parts. And extending MRO networks for localized supply chain, repair and maintenance services. And to get us there, we would like to support local manufacturing and invest into scaled up certification of manufacturers of components, strengthen tier 2 and tier 3 manufacturing, but also moving gradually towards tier 1 production here for MRO parts. And again, strategically reduce virgin new components, shifting towards reuse parts. Collaboration is another very important element here. I mentioned already the importance of international collaboration for this hotspot in particular, where we cannot just do it with our own efforts. You really need to collaborate with international aircraft. You really need to collaborate with international producers as well as international R&D firms, because they have already a lot more knowledge and experience to share with Thailand. We obviously need to expand on the infrastructure and do more training programs to increase capacities and skills here in Thailand for MRO and other areas for the lifetime expansion and the recycling. And the last one is technical enablement, where we talk about the more advanced technologies in place and digital solutions as well that would help us find information and monitor the market of the recycled parts. I'll pause here for a similar mentor session where I would like to ask you to vote for the most important parts of the circular economy promotion strategy for this component. And I can see again that quite diverse answers across different strategic elements. The most popular one is support local manufacturers to invest and scale up as certified manufacturers of components, followed by enable increased availability of second-hand parts for MRO and opportunities to expand MRO services, including building network across tier 1 to 3 parts manufacturers. But all other more or less were mentioned as well. So that means that we are on the right track. Let's move on. We have just a few slides to cover. All right, the action plan. And again, we have three-phased approach here, as well as different types of actions. Starting from technological support, what we feel would be important is in the midterm to establish Thailand's MRO value chain and engage more to 2, 3, but also 1 parts manufacturers and extend via international partnerships and joint ventures, as well as build capacities and training of local staff that would be able to support MRO services and manufacturing. To get us there, we also need supportive policies and regulatory framework as a whole. That would be to support MRO services in respect to adoption circular economy principles. So again, bringing us back to the Japan example that we saw before, restrictions, for example, on disposal of components, promotion of recycling and more circular services, and making them commercially more attractive as compared to use of new parts. In the midterm, we would like to see policies and fiscal instruments to increase relative cost of new parts as compared to the use of recycled components. Next, adoptive policies and incentives to promote use of additive manufacturing to reduce waste and energy use and enhance repair potential. This is a very interesting area and potentially very interesting for investments. Before it may become live, we would also need to develop supporting policies and regulatory instruments. And in terms of digitalization, a very interesting area of action for us in the midterm, with some preliminary measures even before that, would be to develop digital online platform for EEC zone to support MRO industries with tracking and monitoring of used components to see how they have been, so first of all to source them and then to see how they have been used in the processes going forward. All right, and the last meeting for this hotspot, and we would need to prioritize actions. And I believe you have already completed it and we can see the results. Okay, so the first priority that has been mentioned by the majority of the participants is adoptive policies and incentives to promote use of additive manufacturing. That's very interesting because the action itself we put as the midterm, but in your opinion, it has to be brought forward already as a short term so that we can see results of them as soon as possible. Then we can see on the second place is promotion of policies and fiscal instruments for MRO and creation of sustainable and circular value chains for this. Followed by MRO policy on circular economy principles and MRO industry online platform. Well, thank you very much. I'm personally quite surprised with the first choice, but that's a very good point for us to probably bring this action item forward towards short term. All right. We can bring slides back, please. Thank you very much. And the last slide for this hotspot and for our sector is what's next. So what are the main success factors and areas that we would like to focus on going forward for the extension of lifetime as well as for the recycling? From the policy perspective is reduction of barriers to investments within EEC and increase foreign investments in this hotspot, as well as the increased efficiency of patent laws. For partnerships, we would like to see them more for sure, and including partnerships with foreign companies and organizations. Processes adopting new technologies to enhance MRO industries and simplifying bureaucratic procedures in Thailand to expedite permits. From the business strategy perspective, we would like to see modernizing Thailand's aviation industry and building relationships with regional players. On the infrastructure side, upskilling existing human resources within aviation industry and MRO industry. using new technologies. On technology innovation, driving intellectual property rights and strengthening automation and robotization, linking it as also to robotics industry. And on the supply chain side, incentivizing the localization of MRO supply chain within EEC. With this, I will close this session, and let's see if we have any pending questions before we can move to the lunch break.
ค่ะสำหรับช่วงนี้นะคะท่านไหนที่
So for those of you who have questions from the online room, you can post the questions in the chat box. And for those of you on site with us, you can come up to the podium. So please, the first one.
Julia, this is from one of the participants. He said it's not a question, but just a comment on material recovery facilities are mostly SMEs, and pollution control is just written in the official documents, and but not really enforced. So, for example, look at the water discharge from plastic recycling facilities.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and also brings us back to the idea of policies and incentives to ban certain things and to incentivize more circular and low carbon behavior. And making those types of technologies and processes also commercially more interesting for the companies, including for SMEs.
So last but not least, would you like to say something to the audience here or from online platform?
Well, thank you very much for being our audience today. Once again, it's been our first hybrid event since long time, so it's our pleasure. And especially I would like to thank EECO for this great opportunity to work together in the past month for this exciting project. And enjoy your meal, I guess. ขอบคุณมากค่ะ
ขอบคุณมากค่ะและนี่คือเซสชั่นของคุณยูเลียนนะคะพาร์ทเนอร์จาก
Thank you very much